So I now wish to call upon Professor Patrick Parkinson to give a presentation on his perspective. Thank you, Professor Parkinson.
Well, friends, may I begin by welcoming you to my law school. I'm glad to hear Bob Carr learned something at his university all those years ago, and generations of law students have learnt here in this building. It's often thought that law professors are uniformly in favour of charters of rights. George Williams, a professor at the University of New South Wales, has been one of the great leaders of the campaign for a Charter of Rights. What is not so well known is that there are many prominent law professors who are absolutely opposed to a Charter of Rights. My colleague Helen Irving, a constitutional lawyer who is very eminent, as George Williams is, absolutely opposed to a Charter of Rights. And Toomey, one of the top experts in the country on state constitutional law, absolutely opposed to a Charter of Rights. And I stand here to join them and say, I think this would be a serious mistake for our country. I also think that we are under severe pressure, growing pressure, in this country in terms of religious freedom. And if you'll excuse me, those of you who have come from other faiths, if I talk about the Christian concerns with the Charter of Rights, only because I know them best, but I know that the issues are there for all faiths, and we are all on the same side in these concerns. Let me give you an idea of the submissions made to the Brennan inquiry on the Charter of Rights, and what a strong view there was from most Christian organisations against it. The Australian Christian Lobby, a very effective organisation based in Canberra but nationwide, led the campaign against it. The Association of Christian Schools, the Presbyterians, the Sydney Anglicans, the Anglican Diocese of Sydney, the Baptist Union of Australia, the New South Wales Council of Churches, all of them, either in submissions to the Brennan inquiry or in submissions to another inquiry on freedom of religion, all were opposed. The Catholic bishops, I've rather naughtily said, were agnostic. What I mean by that is that they actually took a very sensible view and said, look, we're not saying whether we are in favour of charter rights or against it, but there's some prior questions. That is, first of all, what rights should we be protecting? And secondly, what's the best way of protecting them? And by asking those prior questions, they said, we can postpone to a later day the question of whether we need a Charter of Rights. So if there's a particular right which we want to be protected and there's some deficiencies, then we look at ways of filling that gap. So that was the position that the Catholic bishops took. The Anglican Church of Australia gave conditional support through its standing committee, but only if there were serious protections for freedom of religion. It was a very conditional submission. And by far the largest diocese in terms of active membership, the Anglicans of Sydney, were strongly opposed. The only churches which have come out in full support were the Uniting Church of Australia and the Quakers, a fairly small organisation in these terms. But one of the things which comes through all of these submissions was that the churches were very concerned about religious freedom. And yet we are opposed, so many of us, to a Charter of Rights. How can that be? Well, this is how. First of all, let me explain some of the general objections. Mr. Carr has done so with his usual eloquence, but some particular concerns that the church has had. One of them is about the indeterminacy of human rights when rights conflict. We often think of human rights as absolute rights, but actually most of the problems of public policy arise when rights conflict. Let me give you an example from my area of family law. One of the most difficult issues is what happens when mum and dad are living apart and mum wants to move with the kids up the north coast and dad says, but I live in Sydney, my job's here, at the moment I'm only 2 suburbs away from my kids, I see them every week, and if mum moves to the north coast, then I won't see them as often. This is one of the burning difficult issues in my area of law. Now, if we were to have a Charter of Rights, it would turn into an issue about rights. Mum says, but I have a right of freedom of movement. Dad says, but I have a right of family life. We haven't solved the problem, we've simply renamed it. And Parliament, every year, has to grapple with how we balance rights, how we deal with conflicting rights. It does so often through great agony, through a lot of research, through a lot of investigation, a lot of compromise, and it comes up with delicate balances and compromises by working all these issues out through the political process. But what happens if you send it to a court is that one judge or a group of judges decide one right's more important than the other, and hey presto, you've got a solution, but not a solution which really deals fairly with the complexity of the issues. You can also have rights conflicting with the public interest. Let me give you an example. Let us suppose that somebody lives in the eastern suburbs of Sydney, and this is a purely hypothetical example, you understand, but there is a change in the flight paths, and suddenly this family has got all these planes going overhead and causing a great din between 6 in the morning and 11 o'clock at night. And they run off to the courts and say, but this is a violation of our right of privacy, or our right of family life, or our right of something else. And the court says, oh yes, it's a violation of your rights. But that means that somebody else has to have a plane flying over their heads. Do you see? You can have individual rights, but there's a broader issue here of public interest. And charters of rights are utterly individualistic. Abstract rights are not better than specific legislation. The point is that rights are often just slogans. You can say that somebody has a right to a fair trial. Of course they have. But every lawyer in this room will tell you that the right to a fair trial is worked out in enormous detail through all sorts of different rules and principles and guidelines through the courts. And when you just have a slogan like a right to a fair trial, it's almost empty, it's almost meaningless. But it allows a judge who has another view of the law to just say, but there's a violation of this person's right to a fair trial. And most human rights are, in one sense, quite abstract slogans which are empty of detailed content. To be sure, there's a body of law here and there, but the difficult issues which we currently work out through detailed legislation cannot be resolved just by waving banners called human rights. They have to be worked out in detail, earnestly, in different ways. Let me move on. What are the key concerns for the churches? The first one is a moral hazard. The focus is on rights and not responsibilities. There is in Victoria a Charter of Rights and Responsibilities Act. Do you know how many responsibilities are listed in that legislation? Not a single one. The title is magnificent. The title was there to appease everybody and say, well, of course there are rights and responsibilities, but not one when it came to the crunch. There was years ago, maybe you will remember it, an advertisement, I think it was National Mutual, said the most important person in the world is you. Well, from a Christian perspective, the most important person in the world is my neighbour. It's not me. And fundamentally, the individualistic view of rights can be conflicting with the values which have given us inspiration in our society for generation after generation. The most important person in the world is you in the world of human rights. The most important person in the world may not actually be you after all. The biggest concern I think we have is that human rights seem to be synonymous with anti-discrimination. Whenever the Human Rights Commission seems to come out with a report, they are a one-trick pony. They say, there's a problem, and we extend anti-discrimination law. There's another problem, we extend anti-discrimination law. One-trick ponies. And if we have a Charter of Rights, what we will see is that at the top of that is thou shalt not discriminate, and at the bottom will be religious freedom, because that is the way it is worked out everywhere else. And that, my friends, is fundamentally a profound threat to our ability as faith communities, whatever your faith community may be, to say that you can choose who your members are, that you can choose who your pastors are, that you can choose to have a school which has a Christian ethos, or a Buddhist ethos, or a Muslim ethos. Because if you cannot discriminate, then you cannot have a group identity. This is the heart of the problem.